Chapter 2. Monday morning dawned through heavy overcast, but Ivy was in high spirits. "Papa," she told him over her cup of coffee, "I have decided to take Aunt Esther's offer." Silas was delighted, though had he known what was really on her mind, he would have felt differently. Ivy shrewdly decided to hedge her bets. If it didn't work out with Rader, she had an out, and if it did, she had a train ticket for Denver that she could change to Reno and bank the money Rader had given her against a rainy day. Besides, by claiming she was headed to Denver, no one would suspect her of having anything to do with Rader's departure, and there was surely going to be plenty of gossip about that. Silas smiled. "I'll write her today and let her know." "When shall we say you're coming?" Ivy thought fast. "Well," she said thoughtfully, "winter is coming, and that makes travel hard. Plus, I'll study on some more secretarial skills this winter, so I'll be more help. I think the spring. But of course it's all up to Aunt Esther." Ivy mentally crossed her fingers for telling so many outrageous fibs all at once, and double-crossed them that Aunt Esther wouldn't actually want her there before spring. Cheerily, she added, "I'll go after breakfast and see about getting some correspondence classes set up." Silas nodded, and the two ate their breakfast of day-old bread drenched with butter, milk, sugar, and coffee. Days passed, weeks passed, the dreary autumn passing into the deep sleep of winter. The holiday flowed around Ivy, bringing her neither joy nor warmth. The only excitement came when news of Rader's hasty departure was talked up for about a month before the next item of gossip replaced it from the headlines of the town criers. Christmas came and went like any other day, and Ivy threw herself into her studies to ease the tedium of waiting. Ivy practiced her shorthand and read everything that she could get her hands on about Western mining. It was so different than the coal mines of West Virginia. They were mining for precious metals, gold and silver. Ivy began to catch the same hunger that had driven Rader. People, regular people, could really become wealthy. It was all so perfect. Ivy could openly study about prospecting, mining, and geology with no one the wiser about her real plans. Aunt Esther had written back, saying spring would be perfectly fine, and sent along a basic geology book as a gift. As time passed, Ivy began to wonder if she shouldn't just go to Denver. But the last night she and Rader had spent together constantly floated before her, but seemed fainter each time she tried to call it to mind. Violet was engaged to be married in the spring, but Ivy's life felt like the frozen water at Corbin's Creek, solid, cold, and hardly moving. Sometimes, when Papa was asleep, Ivy would look at the money Rader had left her. She kept it hidden in her Bible, a place she knew he would never look. She rarely read it herself, but it was a beautiful book, given to her by her mother, and seemed a perfect place to keep her secret treasure, right between page 724 and 725. She had other little treasures in there, a little rosebud from the flowers on Mother's casket, a certificate from Sunday school as a child. Just the little this and that's of her life. Ivy thought it was a little funny that all she had from the man who promised to marry her was a thin envelope of cash. Not exactly romantic, she thought. But it was a lifeline, because one way or another, Ivy Atwood was leaving Ravenswood. The pale green of early spring finally unfolded, and travel plans were made. It felt so good to be finally packing. Life moved on. Violet's wedding was beautiful. The church, the white dress, all her family and friends wishing her well. Ivy felt a little sad, wondering what her wedding would be like. It certainly would be different if she even had one. It was late March, and the day to depart had finally arrived. One small travel trunk and one floral carpet bag held all of Ivy's possessions. Blessedly, it hadn't been raining much, so the roads were passable. It was an early afternoon, and there was a slight breeze as Silas drove the wagon to the ferry. "Jeff Miller and his wife will pick you up and get you as far as Belpre tonight." Ivy knew it was Papa's way of telling her how much he loved her and would miss her by rehearsing Ivy's travel plan again and again. She didn't speak, but just took his arm as he continued. "From Belpre, I've got our friends the Sacks to get you to Bridgeport by car to catch your train. It's the night train to Chicago, so hopefully you can get some sleep." They pulled up at the ferry as Silas paid, and Ivy was surprised at her feelings. She thought she'd feel elated, but somehow the fresh spring air felt thin and lonely. Not at all like setting off on a great adventure. The pungent smell of the river, mud, and decay didn't brighten her mood any. Papa carried her bags and gave her a lingering hug and kiss. The great Ohio River surged with all the energy of spring runoff as the ferry pushed off. Moment by moment, Papa's figure grew smaller and smaller. and tears stung her eyes, and when she blinked, Ivy couldn't see him anymore. She wondered if this is how the dead felt crossing the river Styx, that sense of no return. But she wasn't dead. She was young and alive, life fully before her. The deep green swirls of the heavy current gave way to little brown eddies as the ferry reached the Ohio shore. A farm truck with a thick-set German-looking couple awaited her. Friendly Mrs. Miller clucked and coddled Ivy as Mr. Miller loaded up and started the truck. "I really can't thank you enough for all your help," Ivy said. "It's no trouble at all. We need to go to market anyway, and this makes a nice outing for me." Mrs. Miller smiled at her husband. "It'll be a little vacation for Abe and me." Mr. Miller gave a friendly snort. "More like it'll be a shopping trip for you and cost me." She gave him a little poke. Even in their 40s, it was clear that this couple had real affection for each other, and it made Ivy feel warm and hopeful. Wildflowers were budding, robins singing, a grand day for an outing. The afternoon and early evening passed with friendly chit-chat of updates on family and friends as they bumped along on country roads of yellow clay. 3 hours later, shadows were lengthening, and they stopped at a Belpré farmhouse, where the Millers were greeted warmly by their mutual friends, the Sacks. Everybody knew everybody and all their business across 2 state lines, thought Ivy. She was anxious to be someplace where her business was her own. Come in, dinner is ready." Dad Sacks led grace. "Father, we thank you for the safe journey of our friends and ask for your continued mercy. You are so good to us. Please bless this food and let us always remember those in need. Amen." Ivy felt like a child again when Mother would pray for their meals. The teeming Sacks family and guests tucked into hot cabbage soup with boiled potatoes seasoned with a bit of bacon, and slabs of fresh bread and butter helped fill up the little ones with the last bit of Mrs. Sacks' apple butter topping it off. There was a little bit more visiting by the fragrant wood stove than bed. Morning came quite early. Mr. Sacks, their son Reuben, and Ivy were on the road by 4 a.m. The Sacks had a roomier car, and it was, thankfully, a much smoother ride than the truck. By noon, they had arrived at the Bridgeport train station. Just across the river from Wheeling, the little station had 1 counter and 1 small bench to wait on. "I apologize, Miss Ivy, for not staying to wait on you, but it is a long trip back. I know you'll be safe and warm here." Ivy replied, "Mr. Sacks, it's really not a problem. I have plenty to read. Just have a safe trip home." And Mr. Sacks pulled out a small flour sack and sent over some leftovers to tide you over. And with that, he tipped his hat and headed off. Ivy sat on the wooden bench truly alone for the first time in her journey. She wasn't really hungry, but she checked out the lunch Mrs. Sacks had left her. Bean sandwich, butter and sugar sandwich, and fried apple pie, all carefully wrapped in brown paper and tied together with a string. Ivy felt restless, but the chalkboard had the arrival time of her train still on schedule. She pulled out her brand new book, thick with a fresh green binding, of human bondage, and began to read. Lost in the story, a sound began to click its way into her consciousness. Di-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The telegraph clattered urgently. Ivy looked up. The station master had a grim look on his face as he came out and changed the chalkboard from "on time" to "delayed." "What happened?" Ivy asked. "Accident," the station master replied tersely. "How long will it delay my train?" Ivy felt compassion for those who might have lost their lives, but it warred with the nervousness of being stuck alone, indefinitely, in the train station. "Couldn't say, miss. At least a few hours." The sun hadn't yet set, so she decided to stretch her legs outside the station. Just across the river, she could hear the hum of Wheeling, full of life, but here in Bridgeport, it was quiet and a little dusty. "Miss! Say, miss!" Ivy turned to see who was calling. A scrawny boy, not more than 15, short and raggedly dressed, approached her with a stack of newspapers in his hand. "Buy the Hobo News? Only a nickel, miss." "It has poetry. I'm sure a lady like you reads poetry." Ivy was a little reluctant to take anything from such a grimy hand, but he was so cheerful and small, she didn't have the heart to turn him down. He reminded her of Paul Thompson with his lopsided grin and teasing manner. Grateful, the boy tipped his hat and stuffed the nickel carefully away somewhere in the dirt. She wondered why he was there with so few potential customers. In the distance, she saw an older man, just as dirty and roughly dressed, watching carefully. "Miss!" Ivy saw the station master sternly headed her way. "Don't encourage those hobos. They're like stray cats. If you feed them, they'll never leave you alone, and I don't want them hanging around the station." The boy scooted away in the direction of the Raggedy Man, who had disappeared at the voice of the station master. Not wanting to argue, Ivy headed back to the hard little bench to wait. 7 o'clock came and went with no sign of her train. Ivy snacked on her bean sandwich. She read a paper and thought of Papa. She thought of the boy, wishing she had thought to offer him a little food. Was the station master right? Maybe he was hanging out like a stray cat. But what about the other Raggedy Man? Was he out there too? Ivy tucked the butter and sugar sandwich under her duster and stepped out. She called softly, "Young man, are you out there?" And out of the shadows he cautiously shuffled out. "Here, I want you to have this sandwich." Ivy shoved the food as far in front of her as she could to avoid getting too close. But she got close enough to see a very bruised and swollen mouth. Clearly he'd been beaten. Where was the Raggedy Man? He took the sandwich with a mumbled thank you and disappeared. Nervous, she got back to the safety of the station, feeling relieved as if she'd reached home base in tag. Finally, she heard the rumble of the train as it crossed the river, its bright lamp lighting up the night. Her luggage was loaded, and she took her seat on the wooden bench that would carry her to Ohio, Indiana, and finally, Chicago. What a relief to be on the move. As the train pulled away from the station, she looked out to see if the little hobo could be seen. The clackety-clack of passing rails sped her away into the dark. She wondered what hidden drama she was passing by. No one ever wanted to live on the other side of the tracks. But for the first time in her life, she was on the tracks, behind the scenes of 1,000 lives. In the night, as she passed by, hobos would beg, a woman would give birth, a child might die of scarlet fever, and one young hobo would be beaten. But all they would hear was a whistle in the dark, a reminder that there was a world outside their own. Well, she'd wanted more of life, and in these few hours, Ivy had already experienced the uncertainty that comes from launching out into the deep. She read a little while before nodding off exhausted. She awoke with a pain in her neck from the hard bench as the train lurched to a stop. 3 a.m., she reckoned. They must still be in Ohio, at least 6 more hours to Chicago. The trip had only begun, but she already felt grimy. She tried to go back to sleep, but could only catnap 20 minutes here and 20 minutes there. They picked up more and more passengers as dawn rose in Indiana. Ivy now had a plump elderly lady at her elbow crowding the space. Smelling of onions and garlic, Ivy was glad she didn't have a sensitive stomach. Stuffing her scarf under her neck and over her nose, she attempted to sleep some more before the day truly began.